This week, we discussed the topic of business and human rights in conflict zones. That is, war zones, or parts of the globe impacted by armed conflict. Invariably, it is in areas impacted by war and armed conflict where the most heinous, the most egregious, the most awful human rights abuses occur. Behaviour, including company behaviour in areas of conflict, are not just regulated by human rights law, but also a special area of law that only applies to conflict zones: international humanitarian law. Sometimes this is known as the laws of war or the laws of armed conflict. This area of international law states clearly that even in wars, there are laws. And even in wars, there are limits to how we can mistreat one another. Our shared humanity must be preserved, even in humanity's darkest hour. So, a corporate violation of human rights in a war zone may also be a breach of international humanitarian law, and that may constitute a war crime. World War II and the corporate complicity in the crimes of Nazi Germany is perhaps the most prominent example of corporate irresponsibility in conflict zones. For instance, over 40 executives of the largest German companies were prosecuted at the Nuremberg war crimes trials after the war, with over 24 found guilty. Yet, as I discuss in my article, I think it's fair to say that the lessons of Nuremberg and corporate accountability for human rights abuses in wartime is mixed, to say the least. Why? Well, barely half a decade later after the war, all corporate prisoners from Nuremberg were released, and their companies were all back to turning a profit, bigger and better than ever than they were before the war. Justice? Accountability? In a more contemporary sense, I challenge you, look around at an armed conflict in the news or that you are connected to or somehow interested in. Are there corporate interests involved? How are companies behaving in that conflict zone? Are they contributing to the peace or to heightened tensions, even fueling the conflict? Some companies, some industries go where the customers are. Others go to where the mineral resources or oil and gas are, including some geographic regions racked by instability, even armed conflict. The Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC or the Congo, in Central Africa, is a giant country blessed with so many natural wonders and natural resources beneath the ground. The Congo has also been experiencing armed conflict for decades, with literally millions dead and militias still roaming and controlling parts of the countryside. But the conflict has not deterred major extractive companies from going in to extract Congo's mineral wealth. Companies have been extracting, some say plundering, pillaging, that country for years, including Australian companies. Oftentimes paying off local warlords for protection, aiding corrupt domestic government officials, turning a blind eye to the local adverse impacts of their operations, even as they recoup billions. For the Congo, there has been a legislative response, a legal response. US conflict minerals law, and the European Union has followed suit. And indeed, corporate leaders have been investigated, charged, and prosecuted for modern-day war crimes. Companies have also been pressured to leave lucrative operations or assets by public pressure due to divestment campaigns and boycott campaigns. We don't need to look at all the way to Africa for places where companies have acted poorly in conflict zones. Australian companies have been caught up in wrongdoing in conflict zones stretching from Iraq to Myanmar, Bougainville in Papua New Guinea to Mindanao in the Philippines. An even deeper question, what should responsible companies be doing? What does it mean in your eyes to be a truly responsible business in a conflict zone? To my mind, the answer, one answer I offer is that companies should not just respect human rights, but also international humanitarian law, and to be conflict aware, conflict sensitive in all that they do, in order to truly be considered a responsible business in a conflict zone. Certainly, there's been a fair bit of effort to regulate, to inject the law, hard law and soft law, to regulate the behaviour of companies in conflict-affected areas. Perhaps the leading hard law in that regard is the US and now European conflict minerals legislation that I mentioned earlier. Under this legislation, where companies that extract resources from conflict zones, they must declare that to the public. Interestingly, some of these conflict minerals are the ones that help power our smartphones, our TVs, our laptops and our batteries, essential devices, and run on essential minerals for our modern age. The rationale of these conflict minerals laws is sunlight is the best disinfectant, that forcing companies to be transparent about where they source their minerals from will cause them to improve their human rights impacts, even without mandating that they do so. Public companies want to avoid public criticism. Perhaps the leading soft law instrument seeking to improve businesses' human rights conduct in conflict zones is called the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. This is a multi-stakeholder initiative set up by governments, companies, and civil society groups about 2 decades ago. They came together to develop best practice guidelines around how security forces are deployed by companies. Mining companies that often operate in fragile or conflict-affected areas hire security guards, usually private security personnel, but sometimes they even contract with the government and have soldiers protecting their operations. Finally, consider this scenario. What should an Australian company that respects human rights do when a foreign country they have done business in for years is suddenly taken over by the military? The democratically elected government is toppled, thrown in jail or killed, and violence, even armed conflict, breaks out across the country. To sharpen the scenario a little further, what if that company is a resources company who pays massive royalties to the government? Is it business as usual? Do they say politics is not their concern? Or do they suspend their operations or leave the country entirely? What should a responsible business do when they find themselves in situations of war and conflict like this? This is a simple question to ask with no simple answer. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and discussing it with you.